Thank you for participating in today's webinar. I'm Heidi McCutcheon with the Shelton-Mason County Chamber of Commerce. We have learned that the only thing consistent over the past year has been change. Sometimes it comes at the drop of a hat. Sometimes we've seen the writing on the wall. With constant change being the hallmark of our current reality, the Chamber's invited experts at the federal and state level to clue us in on what's happening and what they see coming down the line. To help guide you and provide insight about doing business this year, we'll hear from Chris Eyler of the U.S. Chamber and Mark Harmsworth of the Washington Policy Center. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. First off, we'll hear from Chris Eyler. He is the Executive Director of Congressional and Public Affairs for the United States Chamber of Commerce and serves at Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and Wyoming. He helps develop and implement the Chamber's grassroots legislative and political activities in those states. He also works closely with state and local chambers and members of Congress in his region to further the legislative priorities of the U.S. Chamber. Some of you probably recognize him. He's been in a couple of our webinars since COVID hit. Earlier in his career, Chris served as staff counsel on the Federal State Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, where he advised Ranking Member Mike Enzi on post-secondary education and national service issues. In addition, he served as a legislative assistant handling healthcare, education, Social Security, telecommunication issues for former senators in Arkansas, Montana, and Texas. He's received his BA in History and Political Science from Miami University, Ohio, and a law degree from University of Oregon. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Heidi. Just give me 1 second while I share my screen. As Heidi said, my name is Chris Eyler. I am the Chamber's Executive Director for the Northwest region. And my role is to work directly with Heidi and her colleagues across the region at state and local chambers to keep you in the loop and informed of our legislative priorities, and also to make sure that we are hearing how these priorities and these policies are impacting local businesses, on Main Street and at the local level. Today, I am going to quickly walk you through everything that Congress did at the end of the year with respect to the pandemic, specifically the provisions of the pandemic relief bill that impact businesses. I'm also going to give you a little insight on what we see coming down the path over the next couple months as the Democrats take control of Congress and the Biden administration settles in. So to start with just a little bit of economic data. As we all saw when the pandemic hit, the economy pretty much shut down across the board, and we saw an immediate collapse in economic output. Starting sometime in the summer, though, however, we started to see some industries recover very quickly. And by the end of the year, those industries were relatively back to where they were at the outset of the pandemic. These industries are in the technology, retail, specifically the big box store sector of the retail sector, software services, financial services, really any kind of business that where it's conducive to working remotely. However, other large parts of the economy continue to struggle. Travel, entertainment, hospitality, food services, really any sector of the economy that requires a lot of face-to-face interaction with customers and requires a large volume of customers in order to be successful. What we have referred to this frequently as is a K-shaped recovery. As this graph illustrates, those sectors that recovered sharply, whereas the sectors that continue to struggle continue to decrease their economic output. For this reason, it has been extremely important for Congress to take action to provide support to enable businesses to continue paying their employees, to continue to blunt a lot of the impact of the ongoing crisis and recession. So at the end of the year, Congress passed a $900 billion economic relief package, which they attached to the end of year fiscal year appropriations bill. That bill included, first, it included an extension of federal unemployment assistance, which included an extra $300 per week through March 14th. On top of what the state already provides, it included another round of direct payments to individuals, and as well as an extra extra $600 per child for individuals with incomes under $75,000 and for married couples with incomes under $150,000. It included an extension of the eviction moratorium to the end of January, as well as assistance to help individuals pay their rent and mortgages. It included pretty significant resources directed towards purchasing vaccines and distributing vaccines, and helping to bolster states' testing infrastructure. Beyond that, it bolstered a lot of the federal food security programs such as SNAP and child nutrition benefits. It included $45 billion for airlines, airports, and transit agencies, $82 billion to help schools reopen. We, of course, want schools to reopen, but reopen when it's safe. When they do reopen, a lot of these schools have to incur additional costs to implement social distancing and other public health requirements. This is a lot of money that schools do not have in their budgets, and so it was important for the federal government to step in to help those schools fund those additional measures so that they can open safely. But our real focus in this legislation was the help that the federal government is providing for small businesses, specifically reopening the Paycheck Protection Program, funding additional emergency grants for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the creation of a new shuttered venue operators grant. I'll talk about that more in a second, and modifications to the Employee Retention Tax Credit. I'm going to go into some detail on the PPP and the EIDL grants, but before I get to that, it did create a brand new grant program directly targeted at operators of venues like movie theaters, playhouses, concert venues, museums, zoos, really all of the types of businesses that have been completely shut down as a result of the pandemic. We are waiting for additional details on this grant program from the SBA. They are not yet accepting applications, but the general specifics of the grant program are that it is a $15 billion program. It is targeted at those types of venues that I already mentioned. And it provides grants to pay for a lot of the same things that the Paycheck Protection pays for, such as payroll, utilities, rent, to the extent that you have payroll to pay, given that you're shut down. Businesses can get up to $10 million or 45% of their 2019 gross revenues. But in order to be eligible, they have to demonstrate that they have lost at least 25% of gross receipts compared to the prior year, which shouldn't be too difficult to demonstrate given that they've been shut down. But that being said, we are waiting for additional information on how the SBA will administer this grant program. Our hope is that they will get us more information in the coming weeks and that they will begin accepting applications shortly thereafter. With respect to the economic injury disaster loan grants, if you recall, under the CARES Act, businesses could apply for and receive up to a $10,000 emergency grant, which they did not have to pay back. Due to limited funding, this grant was extremely limited over the course of the past year. The SBA was giving out these loans based on the number of employees businesses had. They essentially were giving out $1,000 per employee per business. Congress has included an additional $10 billion to give out more of these EIDL grants. However, they are prioritizing businesses in low-income neighborhoods. Not all businesses will be immediately eligible to receive the EIDL grant, the EIDL emergency grant. As I said, they are going to prioritize businesses in low-income neighborhoods. You can go on their website and put in your zip code to determine whether you fall into one of those neighborhoods that they are going to prioritize. Additionally, as I said, they're going to prioritize businesses in low-income neighborhoods. So if there is additional funding after they have prioritized these neighborhoods, it is possible that other businesses will be eligible to receive these grants. Furthermore, if you are a business that falls into one of these low-income neighborhoods and you received an EIDL grant last year, but you did not receive the full $10,000, you can apply for and receive an amount equal to the difference between what you received last year and the $10,000. So if you received only a $3,000 grant last year and you are in a low income neighborhood, you can apply for another grant for as much as $7,000. That's the difference between the $10,000 maximum grant and what you received last year. But like I said, what we really were focused on here is the Paycheck Protection Program. And recall from the original CARES Act, the Paycheck Protection Program is a loan that converts to a grant if the loan proceeds are spent on certain specified expenses, namely payroll, utilities, interest on mortgages, and rent. This program completely shut down last August. And there has been continued demand for additional PPP loans, both first-time loans, as well as the need for additional loans for particularly hard-hit businesses. With this legislation, Congress reopened the Paycheck Protection Program. It will remain open through March 31st or until the funding is exhausted. The SBA has assured us that the $284 billion that Congress has allocated to the PPP should be sufficient to meet demand. But if you take only one thing away from me today, take away this, that if you feel that you could benefit from a Paycheck Protection Program loan and you meet the basic requirements for a Paycheck Protection Program loan, start talking to your bank now. Last year, we saw the Paycheck Protection Program funding exhausted very early on. Congress did go back and put more money into the program, but there is no guarantee that if the money gets exhausted this time, they will go back and put more money into that program. So if you are in need of a Paycheck Protection Program loan and you feel that you meet the basic requirements for a Paycheck Protection Program loan, start talking to your bank as soon as possible so that your application can get into the queue. In addition to reopening the Paycheck Protection Program and adding additional funding, they have expanded the list of eligible expenses that you can use those proceeds for. Under the original Paycheck Protection Program loan, you could only use those proceeds for payroll, rent, mortgage interest, and utilities. They have expanded that list to also include operations expenses, supplier costs, worker protection expenses. So if you have made modifications to your business to adhere to public health guidance and social distancing, a lot of businesses have installed plexiglass barriers between workers. They've installed drive-throughs. A lot of restaurants have set up tents outside so they can continue serving customers. These expenses are now eligible for you to use your Paycheck Protection Program loan proceeds. And then lastly, if you are a business that that experienced damage from a lot of the social unrest that we saw over the past year, you can also use your Paycheck Protection Program loan proceeds to make those repairs. One thing I do want to be clear here on, though, is the 60% rule is still in place. In other words, you have to use at least 60% of your loan proceeds on payroll in order to be eligible to have the loan convert to a grant. You can use the remaining 40% or on any of the other eligible expenses, but at least 60% of your loan proceeds must be spent on payroll in order to be eligible to have that loan forgiven. Next, they have created a new second draw Paycheck Protection Program loan program. Under the second draw program, this is directed specifically at hard-hit businesses. And in order to be eligible for a second PPP loan, you have to have exhausted your first Paycheck Protection Program loan, and you have to demonstrate that you have experienced a 25% drop in gross receipts during any quarter of 2020 compared to that same quarter in 2019. If you have experienced that kind of loss, and you have 300 or fewer employees, and you have exhausted your first PPP loan, you can now apply for a second PPP loan. All of the same requirements apply to the second draw PPP loan. In other words, you have to use those. You have to spend at least 60% of the loan on payroll and the remaining 40% on any of those other eligible expenses in order to be able to apply for forgiveness. Next, they have simplified the loan forgiveness process. Congress has directed the SBA to create a forgiveness application that is no more than 1 page for loans that are $150,000 or less. Um, this encompasses a lot of loans, as the average PPP loan is $105,000. So this is directed at the smallest of businesses, and to simplify the process and alleviate some of that administrative burden. You still have to fill out a form, but basically what you do is you attest that your loan was, you attest that you used 60% of the loan proceeds for payroll, and all of your other other uses of the loan were used for those eligible expenses, that you did not reduce payroll, and that you did not reduce employee headcount. Uh, Once you make those attestations and submit the form, basically what SBA is doing, or what Congress is doing here, is presuming loans of $150,000 or less automatically forgiven. But remember, you do have to still fill out some paperwork. Next, they have clarified that the IRS is not to tax the PPP loan, the amount of the PPP loan that is forgiven. And they are to allow businesses to deduct the expenses they use their PPP loan for. There were a lot of concerns last year. First, that the IRS would tax the amount of the loan that was forgiven. And secondly, the IRS was indicating that businesses would not be able to deduct the expenses that they used the PPP loan to pay for. Congress has clarified here that the IRS is not to tax the PPP loan forgiveness, and they are to allow you to deduct those expenses that you use the PPP loan to pay for. Next, they have, under the original CARES Act, the EIDL grant would, if you receive that emergency EIDL grant, it would reduce the amount of PPP loan forgiveness. Here, Congress has clarified that you can receive both the EIDL grant and a PPP loan, and the amount of that grant will not reduce the amount of forgiveness you receive under the PPP loan. And then lastly, and most importantly for Heidi and her colleagues at local chambers across the country, they have clarified that 501c6 nonprofits, which are mainly chambers of commerce, are now eligible to receive Paycheck Protection Program loans. The original CARES Act specified that only 501c3 charitable nonprofits and 501c19 veterans organizations were the only types of nonprofits that could receive PPP loans. We had been working to make all nonprofits eligible. However, we were only successful in getting 501c6s, but that was important to us because we rely heavily on our local chamber partners. And so we wanted to make sure that you all were eligible to receive PPP loans. Beyond the Paycheck Protection Program, the other aspect of this bill that was important to us was the so-called Employee Retention Tax Credit. Under the original CARES Act, Congress created a new refundable tax credit that businesses could apply for and receive if they continued paying their employees during the crisis, even if those employees were not providing services. What they have done here is they have extended the credit for the Q1 and Q2 of 2021, and they have made it much more generous. The original credit was on 50% of wages up to $10,000 per employee. So in other words, a $5,000 per employee tax credit. They have changed that for Q1 and Q2 to 70% of wages or 70% on wages of $10,000 per employee. So in other words, a $7,000 per employee refundable tax credit. Furthermore, the original tax credit for 2020 was an annual tax credit. This new tax credit is a quarterly tax credit. So that's up to $7,000 per employee in Q1 and Q2. So that's up to a $14,000 per employee tax credit for the first half of 2021. Additionally, under the original CARES Act, you could not receive both a PPP and claim the employee retention tax credit. That is no longer the case. You can receive a PPP and also claim the employee retention tax credit. The one caveat here, though, is you cannot claim the employee retention tax credit on the same wages you used your PPP to pay for. So if you had a PPP loan in June and July and you were paying your employees with that in June and July, you cannot also claim the employee retention tax credit on those wages. However, once you've exhausted your PPP loan, you can claim the employee retention tax credit on any wages you were paying, say in August, September, through the end of the year. So and it is retroactive for wages you paid last year after you may have exhausted your PPP loan. So be sure to flag this for your tax preparer and accountant, as it is something you do not want to miss out on. But again, remember, you cannot claim the tax credit on the same wages that you use your PPP loan for. And then lastly, they've lowered the eligibility threshold for businesses to make them more businesses eligible to claim the employee retention tax credit. Under the original CARES Act, you had to have experienced a 50% loss in gross receipts. Here they have changed for Q1 and Q2 to businesses experiencing just a 20% loss in gross receipts. Furthermore, they've increased the employee cap. Under the original CARES Act, it was 100 or fewer employees. They have raised that cap to, in order to be eligible for the employee retention tax credit, to 500 or fewer employees. Now, I know I've gone through a lot of this very quickly, and it's it can be very confusing. So the U.S. Chamber has prepared a number of guide documents to help walk you through both the employee retention tax credit, the PPP program, PPP loan forgiveness, as well as the SBA EIDL grant. You can find all of these guide documents on our website, uschamber.com. They are very short and very straightforward, and they help walk you through the basics of what you need to do in order to apply for a PPP loan, to apply for the EIDL grant, and to claim the employee retention tax credit. Now, all that being said, we can expect that there will be some major changes moving forward. President Biden has indicated that his #1 priority is resolving the pandemic and getting things back to normal. He has proposed what he is referring to as the American Rescue Plan. It is a $1.9 trillion proposal. We are still waiting for a lot more specifics on what we can expect in this proposal, but based on what he has rolled out so far, there's going to be considerable resources dedicated to vaccines, vaccine distribution, expanded testing, more aid to state and local governments. One of the things that we were disappointed that was not included in the bill passed in December was an additional funding to help state and local governments. A lot of local governments are at a point where they are running out of money and facing the possibility of having to lay off a number of public employees, particularly teachers, firefighters, police officers, a lot of first responders. The U.S. Chamber went into this crisis. Our #1 goal was to make sure no one, or as few people as possible, lost their jobs. That includes both private sector and public sector employees. So we were very supportive of efforts to provide additional aid to state and local governments. We were disappointed when it wasn't included in the bill in December. Hopefully we will be able to address that in whatever proposal the Biden administration pushes in the coming months. There are also a number of other issues that the Biden administration is pushing for in this bill, including an increase to the minimum wage, as well as a number of other likely non-pandemic related policy changes. We have indicated our willingness to work closely with the administration and the Democratic majority in Congress to get what needs to get done through Congress. We are not necessarily going to agree with everything, but as I said, there are a number of things that do need to be addressed with respect to vaccines, vaccine distribution, and aid to state and local governments if we are to get to the other side of this crisis. As far as the outlook for this, time will tell. All of this will likely be able to move through the House of Representatives very, very easily, but in a 50-50 Senate, where you need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, it's going to be much more difficult. And it's likely that a lot of this will have to move through Congress using what's known as budget reconciliation in order to avoid a filibuster, which means that that will constrain a lot of the things they are able to do, particularly policy related things, or things like raising the minimum wage. So we will see likely see more details in the coming weeks, but this is going to use up most of Congress's time for the coming two to 3 months. Beyond that, right now, we are still waiting to see what the new congressional majority and the new administration are going to prioritize. But based on our initial conversations, there are going to be a number of things where we will be able to work closely with the Biden administration. As he has indicated, his desire to move quickly on comprehensive immigration reform. This is a long-standing priority for the U.S. Chamber to address the nation's broken immigration system. But more specifically, he has indicated that he wants to do the long-awaited comprehensive infrastructure and transportation package, which is also a long-standing priority for the business community. We are optimistic that this is the time where we will be able to finally see some significant investment in our infrastructure to bring the infrastructure system to both repair our crumbling infrastructure system and bring it into the 21st century. As these discussions unfold, the Washington State congressional delegation is going to be will be key players in a lot of these discussions. For the first time in quite some time, the Washington congressional delegation finds itself with as much power as it has had in recent memory. Starting with your two senators, Senator Murray will become the chairwoman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which has jurisdiction over, as the name implies, public health, education, labor policy, and pensions. But she also will be chairing the Senate Labor HHS Appropriations Committee. So not only will she be overseeing the policy side of things as the Help Committee chairwoman, she will be overseeing the appropriations funding side of things as the chairwoman of the relevant Appropriations Committee. She is also a member of Democratic leadership, so she will be at the table for most conversations of anything that is moving through Congress. Likewise, Senator Maria Cantwell will become chairwoman of the Senate Commerce Committee, which among other things has jurisdiction over key infrastructure and transportation programs. Congressman Adam Smith, he will continue on as the House Armed Services Chairman, which is a fairly significant role given the role of the military in Washington State. And it's not just the Democrats. Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers was recently named the senior ranking Republican on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is really one of the most powerful committees on Capitol Hill, as its jurisdiction is very expansive. In addition to things like broadband and technology policy, it also has jurisdiction over aspects of the Medicare program and public health. And then lastly, your member of Congress, Derek Kilmer, he, along with Suzanne DelBene, are very active members of the House New Democrats Caucus. This is a very important centrist group of Democrats. And given the very slim majorities in both the House and Senate, those members in the middle on both the Republican and the Democratic side are going to be very important as far as moving bipartisan legislation. So we will be looking to work very closely with both members of Congress. So with that, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I will stick around to take questions at the end, but I want to hand this over to Mark to talk, so he can talk to you about what's going on down in Olympia.
Thank you, Chris. Like Chris said, at the end we'll have Q&A. I know that there was a number of questions. Everything is new and changing, and we all want to know what benefits we can get out of that. So I'm going to go ahead and go on to Mark Harmsworth. He is the director for the Small Business Center at Washington Policy Center. He brings a wealth of knowledge, having been elected in 2014 to the Washington State House of Representatives, where he served 2 terms. His focus was on transportation and technology, and also included serving as the ranking member on the House Transportation Committee. Prior to the legislature, Mark served 2 terms on the Mill Creek City Council in Washington and was elected mayor pro tem in his last year. He recently finished serving as a director on the Everett Community College Foundation Board and currently serves as a director on the Boys and Girls Club of Snohomish County. Mark works in the technology industry and is an owner of a small business after completing a long career at Microsoft and Amazon. He and his family live in Mill Creek, Washington. So with no further ado, Mark.
Thanks, Heidi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And you can see the screen and everything's good?
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for having me over today. As Heidi mentioned, my background's been quite varied. I started out in tech and then ended up in policy, and for some strange reason, I got myself elected. There is a 3-step program to recover, by the way, once you get kicked out of office, and it typically involves alcohol. But you can recover from being a politician, I'm told. So today I'm happy here to represent the Policy Center as their small business director. And I'm going to talk about good news and bad news so far. It's been, just basically a week, 10 days since we've started session. So it's been a flurry of activity. And what we're starting to see is the bills that are being introduced in the legislature. And if you probably are aware, but the Democrats right now control both House, Senate, and the executive branch. So bills, and they have substantial majorities. So the bills that are coming through are predominantly from that side of the aisle, should we say. But there are some Republican bills that are coming through as well, which are good for small business. So I'll start with some of the good news so that we have a sort of a positive outlook as we start going through this. The bills, and there are a lot of bills that are going through, but these are the ones that I think are particularly interesting for small business, and they are giving a positive approach to obviously the pandemic and what's going on there. So just sort of running through them here. The emphasis seems to be a lot on tax deferral, B&O tax credits, expansion of existing grant programs, or B&O tax rate reductions. And I'll talk a little bit about unemployment taxes in the next slide as well. So the bills you see here, 1002, bringing tax relief on COVID grants. We mentioned that, or Chris mentioned this earlier about the confusion around the federal level having when you receive these grants being taxed. And right now the state taxes on B&O on COVID grants. Unfortunately, the state can't retroactively give you money back if you did pay B&O tax on your COVID grants, but going forwards they can do that. And this is what this particular bill is attempting to do. And it's working through the process right now. There's also a B&O tax credit of $5,000, which sort of is paired with 1002, would help you get some of that credit back of B&O taxes that you've paid in 2020. I know as a small business owner, in fact, I subcontract some of my business through other agencies, so I double pay B&O. So this one's particularly interesting to me as a small business owner. Tax deferral, basically deferring your taxes, as you can well imagine. There's a grant program from Main Street expansion that they're looking to expand to include more people on Main Street. And then there's also a B&O tax reduction rate for the Hospitality Association based on retail and some other bits and pieces as well. So you'll see these bills, they're coming through. Some are getting stuck in committee, some are not. But that seems to be the emphasis of a lot of, you see a lot of bills around this. So a lot of the legislatures on both sides of the aisle are introducing bills to help small business at some level, and it varies. And this is a reasonable approach since a lot of small businesses are struggling, they're not getting any income, and now they're having to pay all these taxes as well. So along with this are sort of personal credits that are going through. There's a bill for property tax deferral that would affect people that pay their property taxes directly. It's a little tough if you've got escrow with your mortgage payment to get the taxes deferred, but they're looking at that. Pierce County did this last year to some success, and I think you'll see the state do something similar for folks that pay their property taxes directly. And if you're a small proprietor individual that owns a small business, that's certainly going to help, especially if you're renting, if you own property that you're paying for through a mortgage. Unemployment taxes really is the next big thing. There is a bill 5197 which goes in, I believe, the right direction, putting a cap on the amount of the unemployment taxes. And I'm going to talk about that here in a second. And we get into some of the Debbie Downer side of this, because there are some bills that are not going to help our small business. So we'll talk about that right now. The big one, I think, is probably the capital gains bill that's going through the House. Actually, this is a Senate bill, 5096. This is 9% on anything you make over $25,000 on the sale of your capital asset. So as you know, I'm the same way. I've invested in my business over the years, and now I'm looking for my retirement is the sale of my business. Now I'm going to be taxed at 9% by the state of Washington on that sale. This affects, it doesn't affect your primary residence or 401ks yet. But that's one amendment away in a few years' time. And so that's something that we need to be very diligent about. And the Policy Center has had a policy very much against capital gains in Washington. We, as a state, are competitive and attractive to businesses because we don't have an income tax here. And this is the nose under the tent, if you like, to an income tax in Washington state. Many, as you know, in the tech industry, for some of the larger corporations, are paid with stocks as part of their salary package, and this will directly affect them as a tax on their income, and we very much oppose this particular bill. It does have legs. It is moving right now, so we'll have to see how far this gets. I don't know if there is sufficient support in the Senate for this, the Washington Senate. In the House, it's going to be touch and go, but for a new tax, they need 60 votes. So somewhat similar to what Chris was talking about on the budget reconciliation process at the congressional level. They have to get some Republican votes over, but not many because the margins are pretty slim right now. So we're watching that very closely. Jason Mercier, who's our government reform director, he's working on this right now. And so if you want to see the latest on it, go to washingtonpolicy.org, and we're posting almost daily on these issues. The second one I want to bring your attention to is 2085. This one's really interesting in that if you're receiving a B&O tax credit as a small business and you receive a complaint from one of your workers, the bill proposes that you lose your B&O tax credit. And that may seem somewhat not reasonable, but it may seem that that might be an okay thing to do. But when you pair it with the next one here, 1073, which is paid family leave, you'll start seeing some of the problems that you're going to have here. So you may be in a situation where you as a business are receiving a B&O tax credit for something, and you have a disgruntled employee leave you and file a complaint. Well, this bill's proposing that you lose that tax credit now. So, and there's no way of defending yourself. You're effectively guilty until you resolve that complaint, whether it was legitimate or not. When you pair it with 1073, which is the paid family leave, and this particular bill here is an adjustment to the plan that was launched just 2 years ago. This has a significant effect on small business. Up to now, if you are a small business with 50 employees or less, you're exempt from paid family leave. Now, many small businesses offer paid family leave anyway as part of their benefits package. But right now the state's not requiring that. They're removing that 50 employee limit. So if you have one employee now, you have to offer paid family leave. The other pieces of this, which make it very difficult, is they're removing the hour qualification for receiving paid family leave. Up to now, it's been just over 1,000 hours in the previous year. Now they're talking about 90 days with an employer and or $1,000 in earnings. So in the ag industry specifically, this is huge because of their temporary workforce, particularly during the summer for fruit picking, for example, where up to now they may not have qualified for paid family leave. You can have somebody come in and within 3 months completely qualify. And as part of this, you have to offer them their job back when they leave again. So again, if you have an employee that's doing the right thing and is not misusing the system, it's not a problem. But if you end up with an employee that is disgruntled for whatever reason, they can really misuse this. And now this applies right down to small businesses. So you may have one employee that goes out and pay family leave, and you've had an argument with them, and they do this, and you then have to rehire them after the paid family leave. So you can't replace that one employee, and that will significantly affect small businesses. This is moving right now. We're going to see how it plays out. Again, I think there's going to be limited support on the, there will be some Democrats that will vote against this, I think, but right now it's looking like this could go all the way. So be paying attention to that one. And 1098, and for those of you who have been asleep for the last year, the Unemployment Security Department's had some trouble, if you didn't know. Along with the 650 million in fraud. That's an FYI for all the small business owners. Don't click on I'm a Nigerian prince and I'm going to send you some money because they want $650 million. But so unfortunately, and it's no laughing matter, we lost 300 million taxpayer dollars in that process. So ESD, along with the significant backlog in paying out unemployment claims for those that have been laid off, unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, the fraud that's gone through, and not just the Nigerian fraud, there were 59 ESD employees. So actual employees of the ESD department had fraudulent claims made against them, and ESD didn't spot it until they were audited. So there's some significant issues there that need to be resolved. The trust fund, which started 2020 around $4.5–5 billion, is now down to, the estimates are around 1 billion. So they've lost 4/5 of that fund. And this particular bill, 1098, while it does address the social tax, which I'll talk about in a second here, it increases the payout on your unemployment from 15 to 20%. So that fund is going to get depleted still further. And eventually it will trigger a federal loan requirement, which then has to be repaid at some point in the future. And right now, the only way to repay it is by increasing the unemployment benefit taxes. And if you haven't heard, the estimate is between 500 and 700% increase in your unemployment benefit tax. So if you're paying $100 a month right now, you're going to be paying somewhere between $500 and $700 a month per employee for replenishing that fund. We're advocating for a general fund transfer from the rainy day fund to support the unemployment security fund. And we have and I wrote a policy paper on this a couple of months ago that talks about some reforms that are needed to stabilize this unemployment insurance and help get us through the hump here and on to better days ahead, including private accounts. And so we've been doing some research on somewhat similar to a 401k, where you can pay into your unemployment insurance and withdraw from it tax-free when you're unemployed. But at retirement, you're now able to actually draw some money out of that. So we're trying to figure out sort of a hybrid scheme that would work, that would also protect us from this fraud and reduce the amount of work that ESD has to do, because in these situations where there's a large uptick in cases, and you can imagine we all live in an earthquake zone, so you can imagine there could be a disaster in the future that would require a significant increase in unemployment benefits. They should have been ready. And in fact, the legislature put $44 million in 2 years ago, and I voted for this when I was there, to try to fix some of the systems in ESD, and they've obviously failed to do that. The adjudication process that they've been going through as well over the last 6 months has been flawed, and they've reduced the criteria needed for people to claim unemployment insurance. In fact, there's a couple other bills I should have added to this list, but they're trying to remove the criteria so you qualify for more reasons, so you can quit your job for no reason and still get unemployment insurance. And that then goes into the social tax, which then goes against the employer in the following year when they're assessed on their new rates. So there's a lot going on there. And I would say between the unemployment insurance, the paid family leave, and the capital gains, we've got a lot to be watching in the next few weeks here in the House. There are pro-business, obviously on both sides of the aisle. There are several in the Democrat caucus that are supportive of many bills that are going to help small business. And there are bipartisan bills out there. 5114, a Senate bill, which is a bipartisan bill by Mullet and Braun, Senators Mullet and Braun. Yesterday had a hearing in the Senate. and they are basically saying, hey, we're just moved to phase 2 straight away, and let's get our retail and our hospitality businesses and our restaurants open right now. They know how to operate safely. Let's get this thing rolling. So that bill looks like, based on where it was referred to, it looks like it's going to get killed, unfortunately. There's a companion in the House, which hasn't been heard yet. And the policy center is very much in favor of getting things open and getting us back, because using the unemployment insurance fund as an example, the moment we start going back to work and we start not withdrawing from that fund and paying more in because we're back at work, then that fund, the problems with that fund become less outrageous, and we won't end up with large tax increases. So that's sort of what we've got so far. We've only been open 10 days so far for business, I guess. So I do want to take your questions here. I know Heidi's going to give us some time for that. And I also just want to mention we have a policy guide if you're interested in the other work that we do at the Policy Center. And this guide's available on Amazon if you'd like to do that. And it talks about all the great things that we think will help small business and other things in Washington State.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. We'll go ahead and put that link in the chat as well so that all of you can see that. At this time, I'm going to kick it over to Deidre and have her start sharing with our speakers the questions that we've been asked.
Hello again, gentlemen. All right, Chris, we'll start with you. The first question for Chris was, are you aware of any travel restrictions or requirements, domestic or international?
With respect to the pandemic?
Yes.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Biden administration left in place the pandemic-related travel restrictions that the Trump administration had imposed. So nothing's really changed there. Ideally, we want to get those lifted as soon as possible, but in order to do that, we need to get vaccines into people's arms.
Okay. The next question asks, where does someone go to get the additional EIDL if they want the full 10,000? Do you know?
Yeah, SBA.gov. The EIDL grant and the EIDL loans are administered directly through the SBA. So you go to their website, and the application materials and any additional information you need to apply for those would be found there.
Fantastic. And I think we had one more question for Chris, which was, I've heard that there are, quote, safe harbors for PPP to dip under the 60% payroll requirement, but haven't been able to find a clear definition. I've heard if you were required to close due to COVID, that's a safe harbor. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, the safe harbors are related to if you reduced your employee wages by more than 25%, or if you reduced your employee headcount. Under the original CARES Act, you had until the end of 2020 to restore wages and restore employee headcount. However, they did extend those safe harbors to the end of your loan. So if you got a loan for 8 to 24 weeks, the safe harbor is extended to the end of the loan term. There is also a safe harbor if you have completely shut down and are unable to reopen. That safe harbor frees you of the reduction in forgiveness related to a reduction in payroll and employee headcount.
Great, thank you so much. And unless I missed anything new in the chat, those are all the questions we had for you today, Chris. Thank you so much.
There was one question I saw pop up in the chat related to mom and pop and sole proprietors and the PPP. Mm-hmm. Sole proprietors, independent contractors are also eligible for the PPP. So if you don't have any employees, you can still apply for a PPP loan. There is a bit of a different calculation that comes into play with respect to calculating the amount of your loan. This is something that your bank should be able to help you with. And going back to your original question about the EIDL grant and the EIDL loan, just make sure that everyone understands the difference. The EIDL loans and the EIDL emergency grant, you apply for directly at SBA.gov. A Paycheck Protection Program loan, however, you go to your local bank to apply for that. Just want to make sure that that distinction is understood. so that there's no confusion.
Yeah, thank you so
Yeah.
much for clarifying.
And I can jump in and add just a little bit on the PPP loan there. I believe the calculation is they'll take your 2019 salary that you paid yourself, divide it by 12, and that you can then claim 2.5 times that amount was the original PPP loan. So if you made $100,000 or 120, because my brain doesn't work so great. So you take 120, divide by 12, and so you made 10,000 a month, and you'd be eligible for 25,000 in salary as a sole proprietor.
Right.
Great.
And that actually jarred my memory on one other thing that I didn't address. For most businesses, the maximum loan amount is 2.5 times your average payroll. However, Congress did change this in the bill they just passed for restaurants and businesses in the hospitality sector. It's actually 3.5 times your average payroll. So, it's a little more generous for those businesses in recognition that they've been particularly hard hit during this.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I will also mention that Jim Morrell from Peninsula Credit Union is on today's webinar, and he added in the chat box that most of the small businesses filing a sole proprietor is not a problem, and they used line 31 from the tax return from 2019 in calculating that loan amount. So again, reach out to your local lender, whether that's one of the credit unions or banks here locally, and they'll be able to help navigate you through that process. Chris, we did have one other question come through while we were chatting here, and that is the IRS tax and PPP doesn't correlate. So any 941 tax paid with the PPP loan, is that reimbursable?
That I don't know.
So we'll say consult your tax accountant, and in the meantime, we'll try to get a better answer for you. All right, and seeing no other questions, Chris, we'll go ahead and move on. We have just one question for Mark, which, Mark, you had already touched on this briefly, but Senator Sheldon was a sponsor of Senate Bill 5114, and Representative McEwen is a sponsor of House Bill 1321, both of which are proposing advancing all businesses to phase 2 and allowing restaurants, gyms, and theaters to open at 25% occupancy with proper safety guidelines. Both are currently in committee. What is the likelihood it will come to fruition?
So putting my legislator hat on, if you look at the committees they've referred them to, you'll notice it's nothing to do with finance or commerce. I think in the Senate, it's government, and I don't recall the one in the House, but it's not the finance committee. That would indicate they're planning on leaving the bills in committee. So I wouldn't, I don't want to be, like I said, a Debbie Downer on it, but if they've been referred to finance in the House, then there would be a good chance they'd be referred out. But right now, that bill has to go through the finance committee in the House. It can't stay where it's at. So I doubt that you're going to see an executive session on it. Now, the wild card here might be that it gets used as a negotiation strategy and gets pulled later in the session in exchange for another bill. They're called link bills. That's inside baseball, if you know what that is. But it could be that they're used to garner votes, for example, the capital budget, or potentially one of those taxes. Unfortunately, I talked about there may be some trade-offs that are made there. And in the minority, it's very different. You don't get much. The only vote you've got is the capital budget vote, which requires 60. And right now they're just below that on the majority side. So I would say they're probably both dead, but there still is a chance they could come back. But if you follow the normal rules, yeah, they're pretty much finished, which is disappointing because I think that would save a lot of restaurants. I spoke at an event up in Ferndale just a few weeks back, and we had probably 50 to 70 restaurant owners at this event, extremely frustrated. One particular restaurant owner, been in business since 1949, is literally 1 week from bankruptcy. And they're looking at it and saying, hey, we either open and take our chances. And I'm not advocating for that, by the way, but they've hired a lawyer between them, and they're going to figure out how to deal with that, I think, because they're literally facing the end of the road or reopen. So very difficult situation to be in, and I wouldn't want to make that decision myself, but that's where a lot of folks are at.
Well, Mark, thank you for your perspective. We did also have a question if you could shed any light as to some of the cases that we've seen coming through at different places across the state, and some of the folks that are fighting this from a different angle. Obviously, that doesn't have to do so much with the legislation, but some of the concerns over those who are in, I guess, opposition to those mandates. And if you have anything you'd like to talk about there.
Yeah, the highest profile case we've seen so far is a gym owner. I think it's Anytime Fitness out of Yakima. He was assessed a $40,000 fine by L&I and appealed to the L&I appeals. They call it a court, but really it's a board of folks. And it was thrown out. So L&I is trying to figure out if they want to do anything with it. The indications are they're not going to do anything with it. The premise of what L&I was claiming is that they were violating the mandates by opening up, because that's what the gym did. But when the gym opened, they followed social distancing guidelines and sanitation guidelines and all the rest of the stuff that we've got, masks and whatnot. And so the appeals board said that L&I really only has the authority to enforce if you put your employees or your customers in danger. And they said they followed all the correct guidelines and did not put their customers or employees in danger. So that's why the fine got thrown out. And that's an interesting perspective. There's also another gym owner in Eastern Washington that's doing something very similar down in the Tri-Cities. And I think you're going to start seeing more and more of this if the state doesn't open up quickly here. And I mean quickly, within weeks, I mean days and weeks, really. You're going to see more and more of this. Obviously, the restaurant owners up in Ferndale are going down that road as well. So we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, the bottom line is if you're not putting your customers and your employees at risk, then there's some light there. Again, not advocating for it. Do your own homework. But that's what's going on.
Good. Thank you so much, Mark. And with that, I will turn it back to Ms. Heidi.
Thank you. So I just shared a link in the chat there. We just released an article talking about a Senate hearing and how you can either weigh in if you're for or against a bill, as well as provide remote video testimony or even call in for a hearing. You do have to register for that at least an hour before the start time, and your comments can be received up to 24 hours after that beginning time. So I think that one of the things that we'll see is much like the salon workers that stormed the Capitol, that simply by logging in and at least saying if you're for or against these bills, if the more people support them, the more likely they are to come to fruition. So thank you for that. And we'll go ahead and update that as well with the House information on how you can track those bills and provide pro or con or written comments, etc. So before we close today, just a little bit of business. Nominations are currently open for the Chamber's annual awards. We know that 2020 was really tough. If you do know someone who has faced challenges with grit, innovation, resiliency, or simply make our community better, please consider nominating them. There are 5 categories: Business of the Year, Rookie of the Year, Community Supporter of the Year, Citizen of the Year, and Boss of the Year. All that info is online at masonchamber.com/nominate. The deadline is January 31st, so just a week and a half away. With that, I again want to offer our gratitude and appreciation to Mark and Chris for sharing their expertise with us today. As I mentioned earlier, the presentation and the speaker's information will be available tomorrow at masonchamber.com. Lastly, I want to remind you that we're here to help. The Chamber's membership has access to vital resources as we continue to fight to keep our businesses alive. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us by phone at 360-426-2021 or email info@masonchamber.com. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Join us next month with the North Mason Chamber to hear from Senator Sheldon, Representative McEwen, and Representative Griffey for a mid-session update. I'm glad to have seen you even remotely today and wish you a great rest of your week. Thank you.